Hello and welcome to the BSA Town Hall on Race and Architecture. My name is Natasha Espada and I'm the 2020 president of the BSA. As a Puerto Rican, I am the first Latina president of the BSA, and I'm also the founding principal of Studio ENÉE Architects, a women and minority-owned design firm. Today, we will be listening, learning, and engaging Black architects in different stages of their career. This town hall will influence and lay the groundwork for the following sessions, which will address a series of racial issues in our profession and our communities, and discuss systemic solutions that we can all incorporate into our lives and practice. Before we begin, some housekeeping and general updates. BSA programs, please visit architects.org for information on upcoming programs, knowledge community meetings, as well as upcoming online training sessions. We also encourage you to join the BSA Connect LinkedIn forum and follow BSA on Twitter and Instagram at BSA AIA. Equity in Architecture and EDI Network. The Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion EDI Network is a place for individuals in the design industry to engage in meaningful conversations, support, promote, and build awareness, and to share best practices related to issues of EDI within the profession. For our Q&A period, we have selected a number of questions that were submitted ahead of time. Thank you for sharing these. Though we will not be able to address all questions, we encourage you to share any you might have during the town hall by using the chat or the Q&A function. If the speakers are able to, they will respond. Otherwise, the BSA may use these questions to inform future programming. This session, just to remind you, will be recorded and posted on architects.org in a few days. And then on Tuesday, August 25th from 12 to 1, Greg and I will share more on the Race and Architecture series at the end of the presentation. So I'd first like to give you a background on the series and why we are here today. In the spring of 2018, the BSA board created a task force on equity, diversity, inclusion, and harassment, EDI+H, in response to the Me Too movement. Board members Anda French, Greg Minott, Malia Lazu, and myself were the four co-chairs of the EDI+H task force. The 50-person task force looked at how EDI impacted the membership, the firms, and the BSA organization. We created a matrix of items and divided it into 4 goals: advocacy, support, education, and measurement. In January of 2020, we created an EDI and LGBTQ knowledge community at the BSA, and we hosted our first EDI town hall. As we were about to begin our series on the guides for equitable practice in the spring, our hearts grieve for the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the many other Black Americans who were senselessly murdered because they happened to be Black in the United States. No words can adequately express the depth of anger, frustration, and national shame for their loss. As the National AIA noted, each of these lives should be a clarion call to action. They should spur all of us to do more, and that starts by speaking up clearly, directly, and consistently. Racism happens every day of our lives. Just this past weekend, someone in a car screamed out a racial slur at one of my work colleagues while they were walking down the street. They were shocked, embarrassed, and humiliated. This has got to stop. In June, in response to the national outrage, the BSA put together a statement addressing racism and racial injustice in architecture and the BSA. The statement indicated that as architects, we must understand the role we play in perpetuating systems of oppression and commit ourselves to designing and building for equity. This made us reevaluate the mission and the goals of the EDI group and pivot to provide immediate support to Black architects. We now have regrouped as a task force of more than 75 people to begin reevaluating our mission, our goals, and to re-identify the barriers that we see facing equity in our profession. Today is the time to tell stories of Black architects in our profession. In honor of this town hall, this past week I reread the keynote speech that the director of the National Urban League, Whitney M. Young, Jr., delivered at the 1968 AIA National Convention in Portland, Oregon. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do. Here are some excerpts from that speech, which unfortunately are still as relevant today as they were half a century ago. He said, "One need only take a casual look at this audience to see that we have a long way to go in this field of integration of the architects." He also said, "You are not a profession that has distinguished itself by your social and civic contributions to the cause of civil rights, and I am sure that this has not come to you as any shock. You are most distinguished by your thunderous silence and your complete irrelevance. You are key people in the planning of our cities today. You share the responsibility for the mess we are in terms of the white noose around the central city. It didn't just happen. We didn't just suddenly get this situation. It was carefully planned. We are going to have people as committed to doing the right thing to inclusiveness as we have in the past to exclusiveness." So what's at stake then is your country, your profession, and you as a decent civilized human being. An ancient Greek scholar was once asked to predict when the Greeks would achieve victory in Athens. He replied, "We shall achieve victory in Athens and justice in Athens when those who are not injured are as indignant as those who are." And so shall it be with this problem of human rights in this country. I would also like to share one quick quote that says, "The well-being of this country as a whole is related to the health of its cities and a fair distribution of the national wealth. This time it was primarily African Americans and Hispanics who revolted. However, if the disparity between the haves and have-nots continues to widen, the next time they will be joined by desperate people of many hues." This quote was from a letter written in May 4th of 1992 to the BSA membership by M. David Lee FAIA, President of the Boston Society of Architects. We are honored that he is one of our panelists today. Before I introduce our panel, I want to remind everyone that the discussion about race is not about excluding whites. It is about including everyone. In light of what we are going to hear, I want to take a moment to note that this topic is a difficult topic to discuss for you, for me, and for the panelists. But most of you are only feeling uncomfortable just right now. Most minorities, especially Blacks, have felt uncomfortable every day of their lives, and we are used to it. If you want the architectural profession to be a more diverse and inclusive community, we need to dismantle some of the barriers that currently exclude minorities and Blacks at every level of our profession. And this is just the beginning. Today, Greg Minott, as the moderator and our distinguished panelists, will be sharing with us some very personal stories. And I implore you to be respectful with your questions and with your comments. So now I'm honored to introduce to you our storytellers and participants. Greg Minott AIA is originally from Mandeville, Jamaica. He moved to the US in 1999 and earned dual master's degrees in architecture and infrastructure planning at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Greg is a co-founder and managing principal at Dream Collaborative in Boston. He serves on the board of directors of the Boston Society of Architects and is the 2021 president-elect. Calvin Boyd is a designer from West Bloomfield, Michigan, and a Master of Architecture candidate at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. An advocate for both psychology and design, Calvin has experience from people-oriented architectural practices across Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Boston. Currently, he is an intern at Payette. Perla Durandis was born to nation natives. She was raised in the Mattapan, Dorchester area of Massachusetts, and she's passionate about serving disenfranchised communities and youth with her creative talents. Perla has earned her Master of Architecture from Andrews University, is currently a designer at Icon Architecture, and holds the position as Communication Director for Boss Noma. Kilian Makwete is a Botswana-born, UK-trained and licensed architect. He is the co-founder of nonprofit community-based architecture and planning firm Adaptive. Kilian is also an adjunct professor at Northeastern University, Mass Art, and Boston Architectural College. His practice work is focused on international development with projects in Haiti, Puerto Rico, and Togo, Africa. Susan Blomquist is an associate principal at Payette and has led many healthcare projects for a variety of clients, including Boston Children's Hospital, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, and Massachusetts General Hospital. Susan holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in architecture from the University of Virginia. She serves on the board of directors at the Boston Society of Architects as the vice president for communications. And M. David Lee FAIA is the president and managing partner of Stella & Lee. He is a graduate of the University of Illinois and the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is a former adjunct professor in urban design at Harvard's GSD and the 1992 president of the Boston Society of Architects. He received the BSA Award of Honor in 2000, and he was the S+L principal in charge for Vent Building number 7 as part of the Central Arty Project, a national AIA and Harleston Parker Award winner. And with that, I would like to introduce Calvin Boyd to begin the storytelling.
So hello, my name is Calvin Boyd, and I'm a current Master of Architecture student at Harvard GSD. First, I'd like to thank the BSA for allowing me to partake in this town hall and share a few personal experiences of mine. So here's a photo of my first encounter with architecture. Let's just call this contract negotiation 101 with my older brother. But all jokes aside, I'm sure like a lot of you, I've always wanted to be an architect, but for no other reason than that my father worked in the home building industry and I had an affinity for drawing and math growing up. The shelf in my childhood bedroom was constantly lined with these shoebox-sized Lego houses I would make. And at that time, I think my ignorance to what architecture was and who architects were is probably what allowed the profession to exist, at least in my mind, without a specific gender or race attached to it. So as silly as it sounds, if I fast forward to my first semester of architecture school at USC, it was a little surprising to find myself as only one of 4 Black students in my 100-person cohort, and only one of which was a woman. And that was a reality I found upsetting because I had never once thought it odd or rare to be both Black and want to be an architect. But the reasons as to why my existence was a rarity soon became crystal clear. First, the profession is not exactly a viable one for students of color who might come from disadvantaged circumstances. The cost of a 5-year higher education combined with the amount of time it takes to generate employable skills is unreasonable for anyone that doesn't come from any sort of generational wealth. And second, there's just an embarrassing lack of minority representation in the field and very few non-people of color pushing for change. I still remember back in my 4th year at USC asking a full professor at the time, for whom I had worked for briefly, for a letter of recommendation to Harvard, and the response was anything but warm. I was informed that schools like that weren't for me, they are extremely difficult to get into, and that I should probably apply elsewhere. So this is a photo of me, less than a year later, carrying the USC School of Architecture banner at my graduation because I had the highest GPA. I was the only student to graduate summa cum laude, and needless to say, I was obviously granted admittance to the GSD. I don't tell this story to brag, I tell it because people that look like me in our profession are so used to being told what we are and are not capable of by others who are vastly unaware of our abilities. But that was hardly even the racial highlight of my undergraduate career. As we all know, architecture students are prone to spending late nights in studio and are often forced to walk home way past midnight, regardless of how safe or unsafe that walk may be. However, it was in 2014, the day that I decided to depart campus at around 10:30 p.m. is actually the one that ended up being most dangerous for me. Mere footsteps from my apartment, I was stopped, I was frisked, handcuffed and detained all at gunpoint by the police, and after 5 or so cops combed through my belongings without permission, I was finally informed that I matched the description for a robbery suspect. Black, 6 feet, hoodie and shorts, and armed. It's literally crazy how many nights I've walked home late from studio, being sure that my Black body doesn't frighten others, especially when I'm equally, if not more, afraid for my own life because of situations I just described. And it's certainly not a memory I enjoy discussing, but I feel that it's crucial to shed light on the frequency of these events and how no amount of money or education will shield you from prejudice. So how is that incident related to architecture? To be honest, it's not, but I desperately want it to be. Architecture has traditionally kept a comfortable distance between itself and racially based issues. However, I'm trying to make it my work to bridge that gap via studio projects, explorative essays, and even my thesis as of late, which is centered on police brutality. But thankfully, I am not the only one doing this work. Recently, current peers have sharpened their pencils and started to utilize their design education to both protest and fundraise. The design yard sale, initiated and led by GSD students, is an ongoing effort to, I quote, sell and auction creative works to raise funds for the Bail Project and Colloquiate Design, organizations that fight against systemic anti-Black racism. The sale runs the full course of July and has already raised over $80,000, so please go shop now via their Instagram handle. And equally as important is the document Notes on Credibility, a letter to the administration of Harvard GSD from the African American Student Union and Africa GSD. It posits that for racism to cease to exist, anti-racism must actively be institutionalized. And to do so, the document outlines 13 necessary demands, only one of which has been met so far. The list of demands can be read in full via notesoncredibility.cargo.site, and I urge you to check it out. Again, my name is Calvin, and that is my time. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi everyone, my name is Perla Durandis, and I would just like to thank the BSA for allowing me to have this platform to share my story. I was born in Providence, Rhode Island, but at a very young age, between the age of 1 or 2, my family and I moved to Mattapan, Dorchester area. And this area was where a lot of my values, my identity, the sense of community really stemmed from. I had Black teachers, I had Black students, so there was a great sense of connection between the people who I was around and who I would attend classes with. Around junior, sixth grade, seventh grade, I moved to Brockton, where this was kind of like a culture shock. Although Brockton is a diverse town, it was the first time where I had all white teachers, where I had white classmates. And so I became very introverted. And this is where I started to explore my artistic abilities and start sketching and doing things on my own. So throughout my journey in high school, I was really lost on what I wanted to do. I just knew I did not like blood, so anything in the health field just was not for me. But I do know I liked math, I liked art, and I liked helping people. So one day my guidance counselor called me into the office and said what I wanted to do, and I told her I had no idea. So she sat me down at this computer and she directed me to a career compatibility test. And essentially, architecture was the perfect match for me, match made in heaven. So and this is the start of my journey into architecture. So when I applied to school, I got into Andrews University, and this is where my world started to expand, where I started to see different parts of the world, see different cultures, sharpen up my skills that I thought I didn't really have growing up, and being able to really understand the complexities of architecture and urban design. And even in my professional career, I'm blessed to work at a place where I'm able to experience projects from the beginning of schematic design all the way to contract administration, and even have experience managing projects myself. So I'm very grateful for that. However, my journey has presented some challenges. Like I said, I was really lost growing up of what I wanted to do. So I was kind of left with my own devices on trying to navigate or figure out what exactly I wanted to do with my life. And even in school, where people who aren't really financially stable or weren't financially blessed were left to work at the same time, take classes in studio, and the work-life balance was really unhealthy. And even in the professional field, where you're in circles and you're hearing that gentrification is a beautiful thing, or you're overhearing stories where someone is having a hard time at their house and dealing with raccoon and pests in their backyard, and you overhear someone say raccoon lives matter, it does give you a sense of loneliness. And it's that unconscious lack of sensitivity that I've experienced. And it does play a really big part on being seen, on being heard in the professional workspace. So as I was applying to jobs, if I didn't see, and I'm being completely transparent, if I didn't see a Black person on their website, I wasn't going to apply to this job. And just to give you guys a sense of what people in my position at the time, or even currently right now, is working with, the Directory of African American Architects has a list of the most current licensed architects in Massachusetts. And this is about 40 people. So our pool is very, very small in comparison to what the state of Massachusetts has in general for licensed architects. What I've realized in my path and my journey is that there is a lack of exposure and a lack of guidance with people who, like me, have interest in art and design, but really can't really put a pin on what exactly it is. And then moving on to the professional side of things, there's a lack of representation where you just don't see yourself in the places that you're at. There are times where I end up realizing that, oh wait, I'm the only Black person. Oh wait, I'm the only Black woman. So that all plays a particular role in my experience in architecture. If you, next. Next. And so what I've done so far to combat or to address these issues is that I try to see how I can impact the community I've grown up in, that I cherish and that mean a lot to me. So once I graduated college, I started an organization where I was trying to involve the youth from churches, create and explore their artistic side so that they could see the potential that they have. I'm even blessed to be part of Bossa Nova, where this really just plays a major part, a major role in feeling like you're part of a community, because not only you are sharing stories with people you have similar backgrounds with, but it's providing a safe space where you don't feel like you have to walk on eggshells expressing yourself. And even today, having a platform like this, BSA has provided this space for us to really address these issues and create a better future for architects everywhere. And so all in all, like, my journey from my education experience, even in my professional experience, has brought me here today. And I just want to thank you all for listening and hearing my story. And I'm excited to see how we could all have a better future moving forward.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this conversation today. My name is Kilian Mukwete. And I also like to thank the BSA for including me in this conversation. I know that there are some colleagues of mine from Botswana who are interested in this conversation and they're logged on. So this is really something that is not just in the US, but beyond the borders. What I'm gonna share with you is really a personal journey that got me to be an architect today. And I hope that could add to the conversation. So I was born and raised in Botswana, in Africa, and Botswana is a small country of about 2 million people. I come from a very poor background. My parents were not really that well off. And that context is very important, as you will see later on. And I did all my pre-architecture school in Botswana from primary to college. And I also studied architecture in the UK after that. But what I want to share with you is Botswana as a country was colonized by the British. So coming out of colonization had a very deliberate integration policy that ensured that people that were making up the country, which are different tribes, are all integrated, but also of different backgrounds. The flag that you see there on the screen, the blue, black, and white. The black and white is for Black and white people to all coexist. So I think that deliberate integrative policy is something that I really treasure, that gave rise to how I got the access and the opportunity to study architecture. The other thing that I want to share, which I think was really important during my earlier days studying before architecture, was that education in Botswana was made available free for every child from primary to college. Again, as I mentioned, I come from a poor background. There was no way in which that I would have been able to study architecture without that very deliberate access policy towards education. At university level, you could get a government available grant that you can pay up later when you finish architecture. But still, if you had the ability, you had access to studying architecture. The other thing as well that I want to highlight, which was very instrumental, is that during all my studying of architecture, I never really had any kind of career guidance. It was really just choosing. I wanted to study law, but my English, which was a requirement to study law, was not good enough. So I stumbled into architecture by accident, which is I was choosing something that I enjoyed doing, and I enjoyed drawing. So I thought, well, maybe let me take architecture. And I think that should really not be something that happens where students and young people stumble into careers by accident. Next. And one of the things that I want to also share is this: during my studying of architecture in the UK, 7 years across 3 different schools, I was never taught by a Black person. I can't remember being taught by a person of color. I might have, but I can't remember that. And that's 7 years of studying architecture across 3 different schools. And to me, that really underscores a systemic issue. Whereas in Botswana, where my pre-architecture, I had English school teachers, I had different teachers from the US, Yugoslavia, we had teachers from Singapore, my class teacher was from Singapore. That to me was something that, going to the UK, and again, this is something that is everywhere. I have it on the screen right now, statistics from the US, where you can see that 5%, as of 2015, 5% of students enrolled in schools were Black or African American. And I think that again, reflecting on my days in the UK, I was always one of 2 or 1 of 3 of students that were either Black or of African descent. Next. And I think, here it's clear to see why in some instances. As I mentioned, my background is from a poor farming family, that if I was in the US, there is no way that my parents would have afforded to get me a student loan of these figures that are on the screen. This is of 2015 figures of how much it costs to go through architecture. So again, the deliberate policy, the deliberate education policy that the government of Botswana had really paved the pathway for me to be here today. Next. The other thing that I want to touch on, because I'm an adjunct professor and I've also taught in Botswana before I got here, is that in schools themselves as well, as I mentioned, I think it's really important that schools begin investing in faculty of different ethnicities. In the US, again, in 2015, you can see here that only about 3% of all faculty were either Black or African American. And I think this, to me, I see as one of the issues that needs to be looked at if we're going to encourage young people to join the profession, but also inspire them during the time that they're going to be studying architecture. Next. And there's some recommendations out there as well that really focuses on, and the AIA has done some really incredible work in researching and trying to collate what could be done to encourage not just enrollment of students from different backgrounds, but also recruiting professors from people of color. And I say this reflecting on how I got to be in this profession. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't by accident that I chose it. I shouldn't have been. But I also think that there were policies that made it possible. There were policies that enabled me to have access, equitable access to architecture, and also along the way, encouragement to really aspire that I can be an architect who can have impact in the field. Next. And I hope that is something that the background, my background, and those numbers that you can all see, and what needs to be done, can help encourage deliberate policies or deliberate steps to be taken to encourage students and faculty in the architecture profession. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Blomquist. So I want to start, my presentation is going to be really centered around the importance of role models and advocates in increasing representation in architecture for Black architects. So first I want to start with acknowledging the path before. And with this slide, I wanted to just pay homage to Norma Sklaric. As many of you already know, she is widely generally considered the first Black woman architect licensed in the United States. But then I also want to talk about another role model, and that role model is my own mother. The picture on the left is in her circle. She was the first woman to graduate from the Howard University School of Divinity. And she was also, in fact, the first person in her family not only to graduate from college, but to graduate from high school. So a lot of the lessons that I learned from her about perseverance a lot of the lessons I learned about perseverance and tenacity within an unfamiliar and unwelcoming context I learned from her. So a little bit about my background. So I was born in New Jersey, raised in Prince George's County, Maryland. Prince George's County is a predominantly Black county in Maryland. So I was raised around a lot of diversity. From K through 12, there was, I saw many people that looked like me. And I think that this is one of the concerns about the arc for Black architects is that they decreasingly see people that look like themselves from their early childhood through their career. So when I arrived at UVA at 94, there were just under 100 women licensed architects in the country, 100 Black women architects licensed in the country. I was one of 5 Black students in my class, about 60, but I was the only Black woman amongst those 5. And there was a lack of representation in the faculty, but I was fortunate to have 2 pretty significant figures in academia, Maurice Cox on the left and Craig Barton on the right, as instructors while I was at UVA. But as it's been pointed out earlier, architectural school definitely lays bare the cultural and economic divide. And what you see is students Black students struggling to afford materials and supplies, as well as access to some of the most key internships. The photo of me on the left is a summer internship I did in Paris instead of getting one of those key internships. So what I then, moving on to after graduating, in the intervening years, finding jobs was hard. My name and my resume, my portfolio could get me through the door, but I would walk into interviews and be met with looks of confusion. How can this person, be put in front of a client? How could she ever be taken seriously? And so that's a particular challenge I think a lot of Black architects have, is just getting their foot in the door. So when my now husband and I were considering moving to Boston, a former professor of mine at UVA picked up the phone and called his friend, Xiaoping Chen in Boston at Payette. And she hired me and brought me to Payette. And I think she immediately knew that it wasn't going to be that easy for me there. Xiaoping was used to being the only person being alone in many capacities of her life, whether it is being an immigrant from Taiwan and growing up in Richmond, Virginia, or being the only woman principal at Payette. And I think what that has, what she was able to do is instill a certain level of self-advocacy and toughness in me. And I think that is the retention period, I think it's often tough for Black architects within professional environments, is having that support system, is being able to see people that not only can help you survive, but thrive. And I think that's why, and next to the last slide, that when we look at forging a path for increased representation of Black architects in the profession, it doesn't stop with acceptance to college. The pipeline is very important and needs to be increased. But that support system needs to happen all throughout the career arc, from college and education support networks, to access to internships, and to creating a welcoming and affirming workplace environments. And at Payette, like a lot of other firms, we are grappling with what to do at this moment, how to create dialogues and create an atmosphere that's more welcoming, that's more diverse. And we are, like many other places, trying to find the right balance for that conversation. And I think but it has to happen. And that's why this moment is so important, because the firms are taking on the mantle, in addition to some of the college organizations and some of the professional organizations that have been doing this work. And I should say I'm proud to be working with the BSA on this as well. So that's all. That's what I have.
Uh, Hi, I'm David Lee, and I just want to say how pleased I am to be with these young people with all their very cool graphics. But true to form, what I have is an old-fashioned slideshow. I'm going to go through it very quickly because I have a number of recommendations I want to leave us with. Next slide, please. I grew up on the south side of Chicago back in the 50s. And there used to be a TV program that came on Friday nights. There was a guy named Claire Hinckley, who I thought was older than God, who was probably about 50 years old. And he represented a company that used to do renovations to houses. So they would come up with a before and an after shot of some place where they went down the basement, got rid of the big stove, the big furnace, coal burning furnace, replaced it with something really efficient. Got rid of the big columns, put a lot of knotty pine in and made a rec room. And it just really looked great to go from one to the other. And then also they would bring models on and show how they filled in a porch or added a dormer. But I thought it was very cool. So I decided that was something I might like to try. Of course, my father encouraged me with Tinker Toys and erector sets and everything else. Next. However, we were also living in a part of Chicago. It was really a part of what used to be called Grand Boulevard. Some marvelous gray stone houses, really wonderful fabric. But we got hit by urban renewal, which was also known as Negro removal around the country. Next. This is as viable communities of color were literally ripped down in order to provide for new investors in those neighborhoods. Next. So the combination of public housing and highway construction decimated these neighborhoods. And you can see here some of the kind of fabric and excellent architecture that was there. And then looming in the background was what got built. It's part of a whole other strategy about segregation in Chicago, which I won't go into now. Next. But the Dan Ryan Expressway, sometimes referred to as the Dam Ryan Expressway, literally ripped right through the heart of the south side of Chicago and tore apart some really lovely communities. Next. And this was Lake Meadows. I used to live at 531 East 34th Street, which is very close to this, and I'll come back to that later. Next. So much of what really happened in the 60s actually was operationalized in the 70s, so to speak. 60s set the tone, but a lot of it happened in the 70s. And for those of us old enough to remember, it was a really intense time with lots of demonstrations, a lot of resistance to the war, and some attention to the plight of inner city communities. Next. But Black lives have always mattered. Next. It was a period in the 60s and 70s where Black pride was really important. It drove a lot of us. It drove many of us in architecture to want to do a lot of work in our communities to try to make them better. Next. Next. So I came along at a pretty good time. After undergraduate school, I went and worked in Philadelphia for a couple of years where I got really interested in urban design. Came up to Harvard Graduate School of Design to study urban design and met my business partner, Don Stull, who was doing some really interesting work. And this was something that was actually Louis Kahn influence, is another story, but this was the tone though. People were really out in your face about trying to broaden architecture. Next. And so we did a number of things. One of our first new construction projects was the Harriet Tubman in the South End. Next. But a really transformative period for us was the Southwest Corridor project. And again, as I said, I was studying urban design and was very interested in cities writ large, because as the cities were blowing up in the 60s, I was trying to figure out where I, as a Black architect, fit in all of that. I could see that we had battles in the cities, but we needed a larger venue to look at it. So this was one. This was what was planned at the intersection near Northeastern University. And this big highway was going to rip right through the historic Olmsted necklace. And the community rightfully got upset. Next. And organized to stop the highway. But we didn't stop there. Next. We actually came together through a series of vehicles to ultimately propose an alternative to the highway. And our firm was chosen as the coordinating architects and urban designers for the Southwest Corridor project. At the time, the largest construction project in the Commonwealth. Next. It involved literally thousands of community meetings to get the community engaged in the project. Next. And as a result, we ended up doing some of the major structures in the project. This was the Ruggles Street Station at Northeastern. Next. The Boston Police Headquarters. Next. Roxbury Community College, which grew first out of the Southwest Corridor Project. Next. And we also conceived the idea of the Southwest Corridor Linear Park, which runs from Forest Hills to the Back Bay Station. Next. And an area at the time that looked like this was transformed by the project to now look like this. Next. And we also designed some of the other structures, in this case, the vent building in the south end. Next. Which then led to our involvement with the Central Artery Project, and this is vent building number 7, one of the award-winning projects as part of the Central Artery. Next. So in general, an area that looked like this back in the late 60s, early 70s, now next, is beginning to look like this as a part of the Southwest Corridor Project as it continues to be an anchor for new development throughout the city. Next. Also, because of our experience in our work in urban design in cities across the country, we were invited to New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina, and we ended up designing for doing a plan for the lower 9th Ward, and actually we built this little monument, which was the first thing built down there after the storm. Next. Some current projects include some work we just finished for the DeWitt Center, a community development corporation in Boston. Next. We've done some housing. This is an apartment in Harvard Square. Next. But the other thing that we've tried to do is to bring a certain sensitivity and other kind of aesthetic to the work that we do. We collaborated with Bill Ron, on a project, a mixed-use project at Northeastern, where we were responsible for doing the African American Center there for an old friend, a guy named John D. O'Brien. And I was looking to find ways within this mixed-use building to reflect its African precedents. So I looked throughout some African architectural prototypes and ended up adapting some of this stuff from some Ethiopian architecture. Next. And beginning to sketch how we might use that in the building. Next. And so one of the ways of distinguishing this component of the building was the representation of those architectural precedents. Next. We also collaborated with TLCR to do an important school, one of the first new schools built in about 25 years here in Boston. And again, we tried to make it colorful and reflect, again, some African architectural precedents. Next. And this is why we do this. I was out there one day photographing it, and these two girls came up to me and said, "Hey, we want our picture at our new building." And for me, that's part of why we do this. Next. I mentioned 531 East 34th Street. This is about 2 blocks from there. It's 2 blocks from where my house was that was torn down for urban renewal. And it's 2 blocks from where I learned how to ride a 2-wheel bike and completed this project about 3-4 years ago. Next. So finally, I want to, before I go to my recommendations, Miles Davis was asked one night why he didn't play a lot of the familiar tunes that he liked to play. And Miles, in his scratchy voice, said, "Because I love them too much." The idea with him was that he was always pressing himself and looking to go in new directions and to maybe be uncomfortable to find out some new experiences and make it happen. So I want to close with that one, and then I want to just talk about a few things here that have to do with where we go from here. First thing I want to say is people of goodwill are all trying to figure that out. And I don't plan to let the perfect be the enemy of the possible. The challenges are broad, ingrained, and systematic. No one solution will do. There must be multiple strategies, both short and long term. As Miles exemplified, we have to be willing to get out of our comfort zones. Just a statistic of importance. A number of years ago, and it's probably still relevant, 90% of building in the US was done in the private sector. Of that, 10% was set aside in most affirmative action programs when they were being enforced, which I'm not sure they are anymore. And then, so what that meant, that of the 10% in the public sector, the other 10% that was set aside for minority firms meant that we had 1% shot at that. And there were people in the profession who didn't even want that. Also, language matters. Black firms matter. For example, the use of the term disadvantaged business enterprise does in fact reflect the limited opportunities, but it doesn't mean limited skills or a need to be patronized. We all took the same basic courses in school and passed the same registration exam. Why then should our opportunities to practice be limited to certain neighborhoods or project types? I've often been contacted by firms whose principals I like to join them in pursuing projects with an affirmative action requirement or in areas where they think having a diverse team will help them win a contract. But those firms never call to invite us to team projects in the suburbs or in neighborhoods without significant presence of minorities. So many of you sit on town planning boards, school committees, and other organizations with the ability to hire firms of color and the ability to inquire about the diversity within the project teams of the firms that are shortlisted, that are not necessarily minority firms. Perhaps we need an AIA Rooney rule, which is something that was implemented by the National Football League to try to make sure that as head coaching opportunities opened up, they had to at least interview some prospects that were minorities. They didn't necessarily stick with it, but at any rate, they had to go through the motions. And this is in a league, about 2/3 of the players are people of color, so you can imagine what it's like in the corporate boardrooms of America. But at least two good things could come out of that. You might actually hire a really good firm with a fresh perspective that happens to be a minority or women-owned firm, but also you may empower and grow the skills of your own employees of color. Whether mandated or not, look for opportunities to team with minority firms and not limited to just support roles. Bring them in early and in true partnership to explore from the outset, from conceptual design on the projects. I've had to go to war with firms who try to limit our participation to supporting activities, and I have declined to partner with any situation where we are expected to play only such diminished roles. On some levels, an unwillingness to accept such roles has not been a great business practice, but integrity means a lot to me. Finally, the school culture, awards, juries, and the trade publications. A deserved critique of Silicon Valley and the venture capital world is that it is almost all a frat boy culture of persons who went to the same schools, joined the same clubs and fraternities, and then brought each other into the workplace, often sharing pretty similar views of the world. With the exception of the historically Black colleges and universities, the same cultural environment and mindset is present in schools of architecture throughout the country, where invariably Black and brown students are sparsely represented. It is reflected in the faculty makeup, the history presented and studied, the nature of the student studio projects, and the composition of the juries. At my last faculty meeting at the GSD, and previously I taught at MIT, I pointed out that it was all right to be the first, but not the last. We have to make our design schools more inclusive at all levels in terms of faculty and student body composition and course content. All of us get plenty of requests to give money from our schools. How about we condition that giving by first inquiring about the racial makeup from top to bottom, or maybe target that money to fellowships, scholarships, or research grants around issues of importance and students of color. We can also encourage school administrators to look for opportunities to focus with historically Black colleges and universities on joint studio or research projects. We can look outside of the design disciplines to look for project architects with other disciplines with more robust representatives of students and faculty of color: business, medicine, law, theater arts, to name a few. We can also aggressively recruit employees from historically Black colleges and universities. This is going to take some giving up of some stuff, but how about sharing some of your opportunities to serve on juries and professional boards with your employees of color and respective colleagues of color as well? Invite more persons of color to participate as jurors, whether design professionals or subject matter experts related to the project or its location. Press the magazines to give equal representation to the kinds of more prosaic work that makes up most of what we all do, and not just the high budget exotic projects so often celebrated. Finally, make this an inclusive discussion, even if it's uncomfortable at times. I certainly don't have all of the answers, and I don't think anybody does. I want to close with a quote. It's not exact, I couldn't find it in time, but it was something that John F. Kennedy said at the beginning of his administration. He said, "This may not be accomplished in our administration's first 1,000 days, nor maybe in our lifetime, but let's at least begin." Thank you.
Thank you, David. Once again, my name is Greg Minott. I'm a managing principal at Dream Collaborative and president-elect of the BSA, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. So I just want to thank everyone of our panelists for sharing their personal experiences and their perspectives. They're very powerful stories, and I really just thank them for their transparency and also their tenacity that have really displayed throughout their career. I know it's not been easy, as I've plotted my path as well. But I think, David, you sort of laid a historical framework for us, as well as shared some of your current projects, which I think was important to do to really set the stage that this isn't a problem that we've had just within the last few months or few years, but this is a decades old issue that we're grappling with. And I can see myself in all of your stories, quite frankly, throughout different phases of my career. And one of the reasons I wanted to become BSA president is I wanted to bring more visibility to these real life experiences of Black architects with the goal of really improving diversity within the profession. So I want to start off with the topic about schools, which is kind of in your latter part of your recommendations. And just a little bit of my story as a preamble to that. I was introduced to architecture through my parents at the age of 14 when they were building a house in Jamaica. My mom was a real estate broker, and she had a network, and she introduced, which comprised of architects, and that's the way that I was able to learn about the profession. And I know that's maybe not an occasion that a lot of people have, especially if they come from really under-resourced communities. When I went to school in Jamaica, I was not a minority. My professors were Black, although I did have some professors that were from the UK, they were white. Similar history to Killian, where we were a colony of the UK. But I also had Black mentors, and I saw myself in the materials that were studied, that we're studying throughout my undergraduate at the Caribbean School of Architecture in Jamaica, where we also studied not only Caribbean architecture, but architecture that was inspired by my African heritage. However, when I moved to New Jersey for graduate school, suddenly I was a minority. I studied mostly European precedents. Our professors were all white, and I was one of 2 Black people in my class. The other Black person in my class was my fellow Jamaican that came up with me from Jamaica. So we're in Boston now, that has a much different history than where I grew up or where others have grown up. The architecture is European inspired, and the history of race relations in Boston itself, where it's a very segregated city, is problematic. So given all of that, given all the history, David, you've shared, you did, and others have did a great job outlining, you know, what do you think that we can do differently? And you touched on some of this, David, but I want to go deeper, and maybe others can jump in, to educate, mentor, and retain Black students throughout their school career.
So is that a question for me, Greg?
If you want to jump in, start off, David.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting question, because unfortunately, a lot of persons, not just in architecture, but in studying other things, persons of color will come here and go to the law school or the business school or any of the colleges here, but then they take the first thing smoking out of here after they graduate, because they don't see a path for them necessarily in this city. I think we have to get a lot more proactive about our client base, about educating that client base, so that they begin to realize that they have a much broader spectrum of disciplines and firms and people to choose from, either to hire or to bring into their own operations. When I left Philadelphia to come to graduate school at Harvard, in one of my last sessions with David Crane, who I'd worked for in Philadelphia, one of the things he said to me was that you won't find it hard to find good projects, but you will find it hard to find good clients. And so I think what we have to do is work on both sides. We have to make our own profession, all of us, more supportive of each other and more willing to interact with each other and to share resources. But we also have to address the client base and you know, to play a more significant role in the Chamber of Commerce and other things that might begin to open the gates a little more. And then we have to celebrate the work of the people who are in the profession and doing work out there. So those are a couple of things in my mind.
That's fantastic. And I do want to circle back on the client base issue in a moment, but just sticking on the educational front. Perla, you mentioned that you got matched to this career kind of late in your high school journey. And, you know, I'm curious what can really be done to create that path for discovery for youth a lot earlier, and that there's that awareness of architecture as a profession, especially for Black students.
Right. I think that there's two things that come up to my mind immediately. One of which is the architecture profession to reach out to minority communities or disenfranchised communities to see or basically tap into what the youth already are currently interested in. You know, it doesn't always have to be about architecture, but if we introduce it in a way that architecture does play a big part in our lives and give them a sense of ownership within their community, I feel like that could really help the youth in understanding their capabilities and how to impact the world beyond architecture. Another thing to me is the support system, where, like I said, I was left to taking a compatibility test online and just choosing architecture just like that. I feel like I would have been more, I guess, sharpened around the edges if I knew that I did have the talents I've had earlier on in my life. If I knew that there were resources out there for me to, you know, participate in organizations like Project Pipeline, which is a youth organization from NOMAS, or some of the BSA activities that happen, if the educators in our public school system could share that with the students and the parents, I feel like that could really be beneficial in avoiding a late discovery of talents.
Oh, that's fantastic. And Killian, you mentioned that the cost of education, it's mind-boggling how expensive it is, and you benefited from, in your country, access to education that would just been prohibitive otherwise to afford. I've seen in this country institutions such as some medical studies, they've sort of opened it up and made free tuition available to all students, made the education free to all students. But we really haven't seen that kind of movement in architecture. Why do you think that's so?
Well, I think architecture seems, from my personal reading, seems to really not opens it up itself more as it should. And I think one thing that could really help with the cost issue, I think it can't just be maybe schools making it free or making it affordable. I think there probably needs some thinking around creating a fund, right? Creating a fund that can, and this could be something that could start maybe in this type of conversations where, you know, instead of giving funding to Northeastern, say, in general, there's a fund that can support students who wants to enter this profession and could not do so because of, you know, lack of access to resources. I mean, if it wasn't for me, as I mentioned, if it wasn't for the government policy that was, you know, in place deliberately to make sure that education is affordable to everyone, I would not be sitting here today. And I can just imagine what other students and what other kids in this country who would want to be sitting where I am, but just the way, you know, the funding is structured right now, there's no way that they're going to have that part. So there has to be some alternate ways in which students, especially from historically disadvantaged communities and people of color, can, you know, I know that there's some probably different programs out there, but I think it would be interesting to have a deliberate steps to making something like that available.
Greg, there are a couple of questions that are related to this. One is, as an international Black student from Ethiopia studying architecture in Boston, how can students start the conversation with their colleges and universities to add African history and architecture within the curriculum? Similar to that is about the firms. So many are finding getting handed the role of advocacy and educating people in our mostly white workplaces. And we basically have to juggle work, dealing with the mental toll of the year that is 2020, and now have to deal with facilitating EDI conversations. Any advice how to get the predominantly white large firms to take on more?
Thank you, Natasha. I want to throw that to Calvin because I think your sort of statements to the GSD included some changes to the syllabus, what is being taught, which sort of goes in line with what the question that's being asked. How did the GSD, what's been the response like from them? And, you know, what more can be done to accelerate that change?
No, absolutely. Like I mentioned before, Africa GSD and AASU kind of put out this statement called Notes on Credibility to kind of challenge the GSD to, you know, introduce a lot of reforms to address this issue. And there were 13 demands in particular. And a lot of it really just started with hiring more Black faculty, Black staff, Black administration, including more Black architectural history and African architectural history in the curriculum, having there be clear pathways for faculty of color to advance, you know, a certain amount of resources and tools for both staff and students. But I think a lot of it begins with transparency. If you want to change the curriculum and change the amount of diversity that are in some of these schools, I think there needs to be a lot more transparency about the numbers, about what is being taught, you know, syllabi being made available beforehand so that changes can be made. I think a lot of the frustration coming from the student end was not knowing who's making the decisions and having decisions be made before, you know, our input is really taken into account. So like I said, there's a list of 13 demands on that link that I posted, but kind of at the heart of it is not just funding, but transparency for where that funding is going to.
Alvin, let me tag on to what you're saying too, because as you know, I also wrote a letter to the dean at the GSD, who is a former colleague. She and I were on the faculty at the same time together. And one of the things I think is that we have to go beyond the moment to recognize that this is a movement. And we have to make more structural changes to what we do. For example, as you know, you have to take a certain amount of education units to maintain your registration. And when you take those units, you have to take them in certain core competencies. It seems to me that in design schools and planning schools and urban design schools, it has to be a requirement that you cannot get a degree unless you take at least one course that addresses some kind of urbanism or issues that are relevant, whether it's history or whatever, but relative to a more diverse population than simply studying the majority culture. So that needs to be a requirement. They need to not just say, hey, gee, wouldn't it be nice? But to say literally, you can't get out of here until you take some course that addresses some of these issues.
It shouldn't be optional. And just to circle back to the question that Perla was responding to about architecture and youth, I think it's also responded to what's being taught in the classrooms. To be honest, I think there's a huge divide right now between architecture and pop culture. And if you're talking about how to include Black youth in the conversation and even include Black history and Black architecture into schools, I think that divide needs to be less so. There are initiatives like Hip Hop Architecture Camp, which is a summer school that tries to fuse hip hop and architecture for youth so that they know what it's about. There are even currently faculty at the GSD who have built projects where they don't mind, music videos being filmed in, just any way to kind of get the exposure of architecture out there to the community that we are already naturally a part of. I think it's going to help, and not, in education, not shying away from that, from teaching that or highlighting that.
That's fantastic. No, thank you, Calvin. I want to pivot a little bit to, and there's another question that came in relative to the firms. Let's insert a little bit of my story as well here before I ask the question. When I came to Boston in 2004, I was one of 2 Black people in a firm of 250, 300 at the time. And that statistic was not uncommon throughout firms in Boston. It wasn't uncommon for them to have similar statistics, and it still isn't, even to this day, an uncommon statistic. When I came to Boston, I worked at Elkus Manfredi Architects. I did have a very successful career there and received their support. I received their mentorship, which really created for me a great platform to launch my own firm. But like so many others, while I was at EM, I didn't have a community there, which is so important that for developing talent and doing your best work, which some may argue is also a great way for you to be able to even rise to leadership. I'm talking about firms in general, not just one particular firm. So I want to throw this to Susan. Is there anything, and others can jump in obviously, but is there anything firms can do to retain Black talent when the numbers are still so out of balance? You mentioned that the retention period is so tough. What does that mean in a practical sense? What can firm leadership do now to start to change that?
To start to change the numbers.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think you have to start at the hiring approach. One of the things that we've talked about at Payette is really trying to prioritize Black applicants and underrepresented applicants, underrepresented backgrounds. What we've talked about is that it's not enough to let them come to you. Firms need to be proactively recruiting and looking for Black talent out there in architecture because it exists. So it's a stance that can't just be about hoping, because in Boston, the cultural kind of polarization doesn't make this always an attractive place for African-American people to come. I know my family and my friends were like, Boston, really? How is it up there? How are you doing up there? Coming from DC and Maryland. And I think we have to we need to start, using the same kind of aggressive tactics that we use to recruit and pull in some of, what are perceived as very successful and very talented white candidates. We need to do the same for talented Black, Latinx, Native American, all of these types of cultures really need to have increased representation, which does also contribute to kind of shifting of power centers as it relates to social justice issues as well. I mean, I think the issue of representation in architecture and working against social injustice, they're inextricably linked. You can't have people working on behalf of social justice in architecture if you don't have those people that look like them inside the firms doing that work. So that's important to say. But I think the other thing is, and it was interesting that David mentioned the issue of the Rooney Rule. We've actually talked about that informally too at the firm about, do we try to institute a Rooney Rule where you say, out of X amount of candidates, we need to have a minimum of, a set amount that are Black or from other underrepresented minorities. So these are the things that you can do. And then lastly, I'll say also on college recruiting. So we've committed to making sure that HBCUs are on our annual college recruitment schedule, that we are not going to, they need to be included. And we've had some great interns that have come out of that program. And, we're going to continue to try to recruit at those schools. And then also when we go to do our college visits and recruitment trips, prioritizing the underrepresented Black and Latinx and other types of students to say, we're going to set up the booth and everyone's encouraged, but we really try to pull in those students. I mean, it's a proactive stance, and that's what firms really need to consider it as. It's a proactive stance and not just hoping they'll come to them.
Susan, I'd like to jump in there for a minute too. As I commented at the beginning, I was very impressed with you guys and all your skillful skills relative to social media. We need to be able to reach far beyond Boston. We shouldn't only try to figure, okay, where are they in Boston? You guys are a generation who can find a cricket under a rock in Indonesia through Google or something like that. So the notion of engaging far beyond 128 to see where you can find talented people, they're all over the world. Now, obviously, all of this is challenged by the COVID phenomena. But the fact is, you can't just say, oh, well, I looked, I didn't find anybody, so let's move on. I've seen that happen way, way too often. And when I was teaching at the GSD in particular, I'm not throwing the school under the bus, but they could find some obscure architect practicing somewhere in Norway or whatever to come in and teach a studio, but they couldn't find somebody in Philadelphia who was doing really good work, who happened to be a person of color. It's how hard are you looking?
Yeah, I think I also have a quick comment, and this might be a question regarding how firms can retain and recruit people of color. One of the things that I've experienced is, in especially the large firms, there is lack of diversity of work, meaning that a lot of the large firms will do what they do best and stick to that. So healthcare, education, it's all great, it's good for business. But rarely some of these large firms venture out of that to seek out opportunities either to partner with smaller firms, to do some of the systemic, issues that other communities face, like in informal settlements, where urban planning, skills of larger firms could really be useful. And that could potentially, doing that kind of work, inspire young people to see architecture as something possible. So I think firms could do a little bit more to diversify from what they know best, which is good for business. But I think once in a while it would be good for these firms to come out and be seen working on some of the systemic issues that other communities face, like in informal settlements, where urban planning, skills of larger firms could really be useful. And that could potentially, doing that kind of work, inspire young people to see architecture as something possible. So I think firms could do a little bit more to diversify from what they know best, which is good for business. But I think once in a while it would be good for these firms to come out and be seen working on some of the systemic issues that are found in disadvantaged communities. That way, kids can also see what architects do, because half the time, architects really just stay away from this community. So that might be an interesting thing to look into.
Thank you, Killian. And just following up on that thought, if firms were to do that and really pursue that work, in order to successfully do that, I would imagine that we would have to. It's not all about skin color, right? It's also about inclusion and engaging and getting diverse perspectives, getting diverse approaches to problem solving. Is that the case right now? Are firms truly set up to be diverse? Are their cultures really supportive of being diverse beyond skin color? Anyone can jump in on that. To be able to do that work successfully. Anyone can jump in on that.
I'll jump in on this one. I think yes. And the reason why I'll say that is because I think, and there was a question I saw about the burden, you know, a lot of Black architects now feeling the burden of having to handle both their project work and EDI, being that burden falling on their shoulders. And I think that's a very important point to make, because I think a lot of us who are doing this work do feel that to a certain extent. But I think at this moment in particular, I think there's a lot of people, a lot of the younger people, they really want to, of all cultural identities, they really kind of want to find bridges. And I think we just have to make it, the more open the discussion, and that's one thing we've learned recently, transparency is key. The more transparency that you can make in these discussions, the more you'll find that there are partners, there are allies out there. And you just need to, start to cast that wider net in the firm, maybe, you know, from all perspectives, all kind of levels. And you'll find that you can coalesce groups of people who can be active allies and help to foster that community diversity. Now, obviously, the leadership level, it needs to start there to a certain degree, but certain point. But if you get that groundswell at the grassroots and it starts to bubble up, then you'll find that diversity becomes less uncomfortable to talk about and more something that we all have realize we have a collective stake in. So it's talking, it's being transparent, and just really listening.
I'd like to add to that. Oh, sorry, David.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'd like to add to that that I think there is a false identity, or not necessarily a full, I guess, capture of what architects do. And if we want to reach out to these communities, the disenfranchised communities, we also need to have them have a voice in what the type of projects that we're working on, especially since these will be affecting them. So if we could allow them to feel like they had some role to play in developing their communities, I feel like that would also expand the opportunities for firms to have options, more options with people from minority communities to hire from. So that's all I wanted to add to that.
I want to just pick up on a couple of things you said also, Susan, and that is that it really starts at the top, and there has to be a willful commitment to make the changes. And I want to again come back to the notion of seizing the moment. We're all undergoing a fundamental restructuring of our firms to figure out how to work remotely. I mean, that it's so odd for architects, because, I found when we were working mostly from home that, it took 3 phone calls and 7 emails to do something that would take 10 minutes at somebody's desk. But that's the new reality, and we have to rethink that. But it also is going to help us rethink our cities. Do you think that some of those guys down with buildings on the seaport here who were going to charge, I don't know, 25, well, no, that's not even real money to you guys anymore, probably $5,000 a month for an apartment, may be willing to let those apartments go for $2,000 a month to fill them up now? which may then force a different kind of economic diversity in places that otherwise would not have had it. So I think this thing is just going to turn us all upside down, and it is an opportunity to rethink a lot of things. And while we're at it, maybe we should be rethinking the culture of the studio and what can be gained by diversity. It's not something you just do because you have to. Look, you know, as architects, it is our role to see the glass as half full. Somebody else will see it as half empty. What we need to do is jump on this opportunity to figure out how can we be a richer, better profession, and how can we individually and as firms be better because of facing this challenge.
Greg, can I add something to what David and Susan was saying based on the talks that we've been having? I completely agree with David. Where there's disruption, there's opportunity. And in this case, being remote and distributing work, like Karen Bala saying in the chat, could be successful for most firms. We've been talking to, at the BSA, have been talking to the college reps, their board members, and getting them together as a group to find ways of keeping students employed or try to find opportunities for them to be able to do some schoolwork so that they could get credit for that during this difficult time. But one of the things that we're also trying to do is to go to underrepresented communities or to colleges that have larger groupings of Black architects to try to bring them to Boston. But we have the issue that David's saying, that Boston is a very expensive city to live in. So maybe the remote and distributed work opportunity will allow for us to have more diversity here in Boston. So if anyone has any other ideas about how to recruit to Boston, please put it on the chat.
That's fantastic. So now we're getting close to the end here. And I'm going to throw this out to all of the panelists. But what I'm getting at and hearing is really what's at stake is the relevancy of our profession in a number of ways. I know for us at Dream, having an impact on the communities in this way that we've been talking about the last few minutes is what made me take the next step in architecture to start my own firm. And I really truly believe that right now we need diverse voices in order to really create those kind of places that are inclusive, culturally sensitive, affordable, and really welcoming to all. So I want to leave with this last question with what do folks feel is the moral compass of our profession, and really what needs to change now and how? You know, is it the clients? Is it you know, it's kind of all of it. But at the end of the day, we've been talking about this for some time. This isn't the first time this has happened. In 1992, David, you wrote a letter. You were the BSA president at the time. At the time, I was in high school, and at the time, it was what was happening in LA. Now we have George Floyd, and now we have sort of another round of discussions and conversations that is happening. What's different now? It feels different.
Well, one thing I think is different is that it's affecting everyone. Maybe not to the same degree, but you can't just get in your car and go to the Hamptons or go to Stowe, Vermont or whatever and escape this. It's everywhere you are. And as Natasha put well, you know, opportunity comes out of disruption. And the fact is, you know, we are at a moral crossroads as well, where every profession has to address how well it's serving the rest of us. Looking at what's happened with our healthcare system, can you imagine that that hospitals providing basic care cannot make money? How is it that your hospital system has to rely on exotic surgeries to be economically viable? We've got to tear it all down in some ways and reconstruct it. And as architects, again, it's our role, I think, to try to figure out ways to pull disciplines together. And maybe we've got to look outside of our particular silo. Maybe we need a Hippocratic oath or something along those lines to bind ourselves to making moral and just decisions. But the fact that everybody's facing this, I've always said that you could have a $500 bottle of wine and a $1,200 entree at the finest restaurant in Manhattan, but you're only as safe as whether or not the person in the kitchen has health care.
That's really good. And I'm gonna give Calvin the last word here. As someone who will be graduating soon, what's your hope for the profession?
Sure, and I'm not the first to say what I'm about to say. I think on a very basic level, I hope for the profession to start changing how it markets itself. I think there's a discrepancy between, $1 million developer projects to get all this screen time in our publications and websites, and how few projects that are really about this sort of structural change that we're discussing are given that same amount of time and attention. And I think it's really simple, but part of architecture changing is, rethinking those priorities when it comes to how we like to present ourselves to others within the profession and even outside the profession. Yeah, that's all I really have to say.
That's great. Oh, thank you, Calvin, and thank you to all our panelists. This won't be the last discussion. I feel like we're just getting started here. This is kind of a primer. This is a series. I will hand it back over to Natasha to kind of close us out. But I really want to thank everyone for your transparency, your candor, and your just being vulnerable with sharing your stories, which I know has impacted me, and I'm sure has impacted all of our audience. So thank you so much for being bold and courageous.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to all of the panelists. A couple of items as next steps. The programs will take place on the 4th Tuesday of every month. And so please save the date for August 25th from 12 to 1:30. Also, Greg and I are working with Artists for Humanity Design Partnership and the BSA staff with a diverse group of the graphic design students to create the identity for this series. So we plan to unveil the new identity for the August program. And then sponsorship, the BSA is committed to providing resources that are valuable and useful for our members and community, including the Race and Architecture series. To discuss sponsor opportunities and collaboration opportunities, please contact Patricia Olshan and polshan@architects.org. I also want to mention one additional piece that I think is going to be really important for this conversation. And that is, we are introducing discourse. I put together a task force on best practices. We worked on a COVID-19 best practice guide at the beginning of the spring. We also, from that came ideas about best practices moving forward. And instead of putting it into that manual, we actually have been working with the BSA on this platform that is called Discourse. It's a new forum to share ideas and move forward the conversation on equity, architecture, design, and sustainability, and any other topics you are interested in. So please look out for an email with information on how to access this platform, and it will be on the website. We also encourage you to support the organizations committed to addressing the injustices of racism in our communities, including the design world. You can find that list on the BSA website, including the National Organization of Minority Architects, NOMA, and the Boston chapter, where Perla is the communications director and doing a great job. There's also Black in Design, Hip Hop Architecture, and Who Builds Your Architecture. And we also invite you to join the BSA's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion EDI network. So thank you all for joining us. You can stay up to date on our latest news at architects.org. Please share your feedback at communications@architects.org. And thank you again for joining us, and I hope you can join us for the next event in the series on Tuesday, August 25th.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.